Picture this, it's 1569. Queen Elizabeth I is on the throne, but she's facing a crisis that could cost her everything. For a few nail-biting weeks, a massive army is marching south, and their goal is to turn back the clock on religion and completely shake up her government. Today, we're digging into the Northern Rebellion to figure out what on earth drove thousands of people to risk it all and rise up against their queen.
All right, let's get right to it. The big question we're tackling is, on the surface, pretty simple. Why did the north of England rebel in 1569? But the answer? Oh, it's anything but simple. Was this about raw politics, deep religious faith, or something else entirely? Let's find out.
So we're talking about a full-on rebellion in the north. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some small-time protest. This was a direct challenge to the Tudor throne, led by some of the most powerful men in the country. The stakes were incredibly high.
To get a feel for this, you have to appreciate how fast it all happened. It just exploded. November 9th, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmorland raised their banners. Just 5 days later, they've stormed Durham Cathedral, torn down all the Protestant stuff, and held a very illegal Catholic Mass. Their army swells to almost 6,000 strong. And then, poof, it's over. By mid-December, word gets out that a huge royal army is on its way, the rebel leaders totally lose their nerve, and the whole thing just scatters. No big final battle, nothing. So you have to wonder, what was all that about?
Okay, first up, let's look at the political angle. Was this whole thing just a feudal power struggle? You know, one last desperate attempt by the old guard to cling to power? At the heart of this, you really have a clash of two different worlds. On one side, you've got the old guard, the Percys and the Nevilles. These families were ancient, powerful. They'd basically run the north like their own private kingdom for centuries. And on the other side, you have Elizabeth's new men, guys like her right-hand man, William Cecil. These weren't powerful lords, they were smart, professional politicians, centralizing all the power in London. And for those old earls in the north, you can just imagine it felt like their entire world was being dismantled right before their eyes.
And all that resentment boiled over into an actual conspiracy. I mean, these earls felt totally sidelined, ignored by the Queen's inner circle in London. So they hatched a plan. The centerpiece was this audacious scheme to marry Mary Queen of Scots, who, remember, was Catholic and had a claim to the throne, to England's top nobleman, the Duke of Norfolk. Now, they claimed they didn't want to overthrow Elizabeth. They just wanted to force her to get rid of her, evil counselors and give them their power back. Right.
So, this brings us to one major school of thought. Historians like the great G.R. Elton and Wallace McCaffrey look at all this and say, look, this was a political fight, plain and simple. In their view, all the religious talk was just a convenient cover story, a good way to get people to sign up. The real motive? The raw ambition of a dying aristocracy making one last, desperate grab for power.
But hold on. Politics is one thing. But a conspiracy between a couple of disgruntled earls doesn't explain why thousands of ordinary people would risk being hanged for treason. For that part of the story, we have to look at something else. Something incredibly powerful. Religion.
You have to understand, the north of England was different. It was deeply, deeply conservative when it came to faith. People there were still attached to the old ways, the Latin Mass, the saints, all the familiar rituals. So when Elizabeth's Protestant reforms started sweeping the country, many in the north didn't see it as progress. They saw it as an attack on the sacred, an attempt to destroy everything they held dear.
And you can see this so clearly in the symbols they used. The rebels marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. Now, this was not just a random flag. It was a hugely powerful Catholic symbol, and crucially, it was the exact same banner used in an earlier Catholic rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace. This was a deliberate signal, a message that everyone in the North would have understood instantly.
So what was it that got people so fired up? Well, imagine walking into the church you've attended your whole life to find the stone altars smashed and the statues of the saints gone. People were furious. They hated the new Protestant bishops, and they desperately wanted the comfort of the old Latin Mass back. And for them, Mary Queen of Scots, locked away but still a Catholic queen, was this huge symbol of hope.
This brings us to the other side of the debate. Historians like Christopher High and Fletcher and McCulloch, they make a really compelling case. They say, sure, the Earl's political plot might have been the spark, but religion? Religion was the fuel that turned this into a massive fire. For them, faith is the key ingredient that explains how a court conspiracy became a genuine popular uprising.
But wait, there's one more angle to check. What about the economy? Was this about people being poor, hungry, and desperate? let's take a quick look at the socioeconomic factors.
I mean, plenty of other rebellions in this period were what historians call a rebellion of the belly, protests against things like high rents or landlords fencing off common land. So we've got to ask, was this one of those? Well, the consensus from historians like Andy Wood is a pretty clear no. Not really. Of course, there were economic problems in the north. They were everywhere, but they just weren't the main driver here. And the biggest piece of evidence is what the rebels themselves were shouting about. Their demands were all about religion and politics, not about rent. So yeah, we can pretty much put the economic argument to one side.
Okay, so we're left with two major suspects, a political power play and a religious crusade. To try and get to the bottom of this, let's look at a fascinating piece of evidence, the confession of one of the guys who started the whole thing.
So after the whole thing collapses, the Earl of Northumberland is captured. And in 1572, right before he's executed, he's interrogated. This official record, his examination, is incredible because it's his own explanation for why he did it. But here's the catch. Can you really trust what a man says when he's literally about to lose his head? Let's break it down. All right, let's put on our detective hats. Claim number 1. Northumberland says their first object was the reformation of religion. Well, that checks out. It's exactly what they did in Durham. But on the other hand, wouldn't you rather be remembered as a religious martyr than a common traitor? Claim number 2. He says it was about securing the Queen of Scots. Again, this fits with the political plot we know about, but it's also a pretty convenient way to shift some of the blame onto her, right? And finally, he claims he was just afraid for his life and his lands. Plausible. Elizabeth's government really was squeezing him. But the massive weakness here is the context. This guy is under incredible duress. Is he telling the truth or just saying whatever he thinks might save him?
So, what's the final verdict? Well, the Earl's own muddled confession kind of gives the game away. This wasn't about one thing. It was a toxic, volatile cocktail. You had the political ambition of the elites mixed with the genuine religious anger of the common people. Neither one alone would have been enough to start a rebellion. But when you put them together, boom.
So if we were to break it down, it might look something like this. Religious zeal is the biggest slice of the pie. That's what got thousands of ordinary people out of their homes and on the march. But political ambition is right behind it. That provided the leadership and the initial plan. Throw in a little bit of old-school feudal loyalty, and then, way down at the bottom, you have economic hardship. It's barely even a factor. The rebellion's collapse was just as fast as its rise. As soon as a real army showed up, the rebels just went home. But Elizabeth's response was anything but weak. It was utterly brutal. She ordered mass executions to send a message, and about 700 ordinary rebels were hanged in their own villages as a warning. As for the great Percy and Neville families that started it all, it was game over. Their power was shattered and their lands were taken by the crown.
And that is the real takeaway here. The crushing of the Northern Rebellion was so much more than just stopping an uprising. It was a massive turning point in English history. It was the final, bloody showdown between the new, centralized Tudor government in London and the old, semi-independent feudal lords of the past. And the central state won, decisively.
Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. Should we see this rebellion as the last gasp of medieval England, the final roar of a dying world? Or was it actually something new, one of the first major growing pains of a modernizing nation, struggling with massive religious and political change? The real answer, as we've seen, is probably that it was both, all tangled up in one fascinating failed rebellion.